The courtroom was packed. Rows of people sat shoulder to shoulder, their eyes darting nervously between the judge, the lawyers, and the woman seated on the stand. The air was thick with tension, and a murmur of quiet whispers rippled through the room. In the middle of it all stood a little boy, no older than 8, clutching the edge of a polished oak table. His small hands trembled slightly, but his face was calm, too calm for a child his age. "Please state your full name," the judge said, his voice firm but kind. The boy took a deep breath, his chest rising and falling as he steadied himself. "My name is Ethan Carter," he said softly, but his voice carried an unexpected strength that made the room fall silent. Ethan's mother, sitting a few feet away, shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Dressed in a crisp blouse and tailored skirt, she looked every bit the picture of a concerned parent. But there was something in her eyes, something uneasy, almost fearful, as she glanced at her son. The case was about custody. Ethan's parents were locked in a bitter battle over who would take care of him. His father sat on the other side of the courtroom, his face lined with worry. The tension between the two parents was palpable, and everyone in the room could feel it, but no one expected what would happen next. "Ethan," the judge continued, leaning slightly forward, "I know this is a lot to ask of you, but I need you to tell the truth. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded, his brown eyes wide and unblinking. "Yes, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady. The room held its collective breath. Ethan's testimony was crucial. His words could tilt the case in favor of one parent or the other, and both lawyers were poised to analyze every syllable. The judge smiled gently. "Good. Now, can you tell us how things are at home? Do you feel safe with your mom and dad?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes flickering to his mother. She gave him a small, encouraging smile, but her hands were clenched into fists on her lap. The boy's gaze shifted to his father, who offered a slight nod as if to say, "It's okay, son. Tell the truth." For a moment, Ethan seemed lost in thought. Then he took another deep breath and spoke. "Mommy says that Daddy doesn't care about me," he said slowly, his voice trembling just a little. Ethan's mother's face turned pale, and a few gasps rippled through the room. She opened her mouth to speak, but the judge raised a hand to silence her. Ethan continued, his words more hurried now, as if he couldn't hold them in any longer. "She says Daddy doesn't want me, that he's too busy for me. But that's not true." The boy's voice cracked, and tears welled up in his eyes. He wiped them away quickly, as if embarrassed to cry in front of so many strangers. "What do you mean, Ethan?" the judge asked gently, his tone urging the boy to go on. Ethan looked directly at the judge, his small fists clenched at his sides. "Mommy is lying," he said, his voice rising just enough to be heard clearly in every corner of the room. The courtroom erupted into chaos. Ethan's mother jumped to her feet, protesting loudly, while the lawyers scrambled to regain control of the situation. The judge banged his gavel, calling for order, but the damage was already done. As the room quieted down, Ethan's father sat frozen in his seat, tears streaming down his face. Ethan, still standing at the table, seemed to grow smaller under the weight of the room's collective gaze. But his next words were what truly left everyone speechless. "They told me not to say anything," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But I have to tell the truth." And with that, Ethan began to reveal a shocking truth that would change everything, not just for his family, but for everyone in that courtroom. Ethan's voice hung in the air like a fragile thread, barely holding together the silence that had blanketed the room. The judge leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, but his eyes heavy with concern. Everyone was waiting, their breaths caught in their throats, as if the little boy's next words carried the weight of the entire case. "My mommy. She told me to say things about Daddy," Ethan started, his voice trembling now. His small hands gripped the edge of the table again, his knuckles turning white. "She said if I didn't then bad things would happen to me." Gasps rippled through the room again, and Ethan's mother, her face now flushed red, stood abruptly. "That's not true," she exclaimed, her voice sharp and defensive. "He's confused, he doesn't know what he's saying." The judge banged his gavel twice, his firm gaze locking on her. "Mrs. Carter, sit down. You will have your turn to respond," he said sternly, and her voice faltered as she sank back into her chair, her lips pressed into a thin line. Ethan glanced at her nervously, but he didn't stop. "I love my mommy," he said, his voice cracking with emotion. "But she makes me scared sometimes. She says I can't talk about things that happen at home. She says people wouldn't believe me anyway." The judge leaned forward, his tone softening. "Ethan, you're doing very well. Can you tell us what kind of things your mommy told you to say about your dad?" Ethan's eyes filled with tears, and he wiped them away quickly with the sleeve of his shirt. "She said I should tell people that Daddy hurt me," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "But he didn't. He never did. Daddy loves me. He always takes care of me when I'm with him. He even—" Ethan paused, his small face scrunching up as he fought to hold back a sob. "He even told me it's okay to love Mommy, even if she's mean to him." The room fell deathly silent. Ethan's father, sitting across the courtroom, lowered his head into his hands, his shoulders shaking. It was clear that every word from his son's mouth was both heartbreaking and relieving all at once. The judge nodded slowly, his expression remaining neutral, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of sadness. "Ethan, I know this is really hard for you. Thank you for being so brave and honest. Can you tell me, has your mommy ever said things about your dad that make you feel confused or upset?" Ethan nodded quickly, his lips trembling. "She says Daddy doesn't love me. She says he only wants me so he can take me away from her and make her sad." Another murmur swept through the courtroom, and the judge raised his hand to quiet it. "But that's not true," Ethan added, his voice rising with urgency. "Daddy always says he wants me to be happy, and he never says mean things about Mommy. He just wants me to feel safe." The raw honesty of Ethan's words sent a wave of emotion through the room. Even the court reporter, usually a stoic presence in the proceedings, seemed to blink back tears as she typed furiously to capture every word. Ethan's mother, however, looked increasingly agitated. Her fingers tapped restlessly on the table, and her lips curled into a tight frown. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering something urgently, but her lawyer gave her a sharp look and shook his head. The judge turned his attention back to Ethan. "Ethan, can you tell me about your time with your mom? Does she do things that make you feel scared, or do you feel safe with her?" Ethan hesitated, his small frame tense, as if he was carrying a weight far too heavy for someone his age. "Sometimes she yells," he admitted quietly, "and she gets mad a lot. She says bad things about Daddy, and she tells me I have to choose who I love more." The judge's face softened with concern. "That's a very big thing for a little boy to have to think about," he said gently. "Do you feel like you have to pick one of your parents?" Ethan nodded, his eyes filling with fresh tears. "I don't want to pick," he said, his voice breaking. "I love them both. But Mommy says I can't love Daddy if I love her. She says it makes her sad when I talk about him." Across the courtroom, Ethan's father wiped his face with his hands, his heartbreak visible to everyone in the room. He looked up at his son, his eyes filled with love and silent encouragement. "Ethan," the judge said after a moment, his voice steady but kind, "do you want to tell me anything else? Anything that you think is important for me to know?" The boy hesitated again, glancing nervously at his mother. Her expression was now a mixture of anger and desperation, and Ethan's small body seemed to shrink under her gaze. "You can say anything you need to, Ethan," the judge reassured him. "This is a safe place. No one can hurt you here." Ethan took a shaky breath, his chest rising and falling as he built up the courage to speak. Sometimes Mommy says if I don't do what she says, she won't love me anymore," he said, his voice trembling. "She says she'll leave me all alone." A collective gasp echoed through the courtroom, and Ethan's mother's face turned pale. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but her lawyer placed a firm hand on her arm, shaking his head again. Ethan's words lingered in the air like a heavy cloud, the weight of them pressing down on everyone in the room. The judge's face remained calm, but his eyes were filled with a quiet determination. "Thank you, Ethan," he said finally, his tone gentle but firm. "You've been very brave. I know this hasn't been easy for you." Ethan nodded, his small hands still gripping the edge of the table. His eyes darted nervously toward his mother, but he didn't say anything else. The judge turned to the lawyers. "We'll take a brief recess before we continue," he said, banging his gavel once. As the courtroom began to clear, Ethan's mother stood abruptly, her face a mix of anger and panic. She stormed toward her lawyer, her voice rising in frantic whispers that carried faintly across the room. Ethan, meanwhile, sat quietly at the table, his small frame looking even smaller in the large courtroom. His father approached cautiously, kneeling beside him and placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did great, buddy," his father said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so proud of you." Ethan looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "I just want everything to be okay," he whispered. His father nodded, pulling him into a protective hug. "Me too, Ethan, me too." But as they sat there, the tension in the room didn't dissipate. If anything, it grew heavier, the weight of unanswered questions and unresolved truths hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. Something told everyone in that room that the most shocking revelations were still to come. The courtroom was quieter now, the kind of silence that carried weight, as if every word spoken would echo louder than intended. Ethan sat beside his father during the recess, clutching the edge of his chair while glancing nervously toward his mother. She stood near her lawyer, her movements sharp and agitated, as if trying to rein in emotions that threatened to spill out. Ethan's father rubbed his back gently, trying to calm him. "You don't have to worry now, son," he whispered. "You've been so brave, and I'm right here. Always." Ethan nodded but didn't say anything. His gaze remained fixed on his mother, who suddenly turned her head toward him. Their eyes met for a split second, and Ethan immediately looked away, his small shoulders hunching under the weight of her unspoken words. Nearby, the lawyers exchanged quiet but intense conversations. Ethan's mother's attorney gestured animatedly, his whispered tone growing sharper as he leaned toward her. "You have to stay calm," he hissed. "This is already going sideways. If you lose your temper in there, it'll only make things worse." She shook her head, her frustration evident. "He's lying," she insisted, her voice rising just enough to catch the attention of a few people lingering in the room. "He doesn't understand what's happening. He's just a kid. He doesn't know what he's saying." Her lawyer sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. "The more you push that narrative, the more it looks like you're trying to discredit him. We need to focus on damage control, not digging the hole deeper." On the other side of the room, Ethan's father's attorney approached him with a calm but determined expression. "This testimony changes everything," she said in a low voice. "The court will take his words seriously, but we still need more. They'll want proof of what he's alleging. Without it, this could swing back in her favor." Ethan's father nodded slowly, his jaw tightening. "I know, but I won't put him through any more than he's already been through. He's just a little boy." The attorney placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "I understand, but the stakes are high. If she gets custody, who knows what he'll have to endure. We need to do this the right way." As the recess ended and everyone began filing back into the courtroom, the tension returned with full force. Ethan's mother took her seat, her expression carefully composed now, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of unease. Ethan's father sat beside his attorney, his hand resting protectively on Ethan's shoulder. The judge re-entered and the room fell silent again. He took his seat and surveyed the courtroom, his gaze lingering on Ethan for a moment before addressing the lawyers. "We'll continue with the testimony shortly, but first, I'd like to hear from the attorneys regarding the allegations raised. Mrs. Carter's counsel, you may proceed." Her lawyer stood, adjusting his tie before speaking. "Your Honor, while we respect the court's process and the importance of hearing the child's perspective, we believe that Ethan's testimony may have been influenced. He's a young boy, impressionable and vulnerable. It's possible that he's been coached or missiled, whether intentionally or unintentionally." The words hung in the air, and Ethan's father's attorney immediately stood to respond. "Your Honor, this is not the first time we've seen attempts to discredit Ethan's honesty. The child has spoken clearly and consistently about his experiences. Suggesting he's been coached is not only baseless but also dismissive of the courage it took for him to speak up today." The judge raised a hand, signaling them to stop. "Let's focus on facts, not speculation. If there's evidence to support these claims, present it. Otherwise, we'll proceed based on the testimony provided." Ethan's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her hands gripping the edge of the table. She glanced sideways at her attorney, who gave her a subtle but firm shake of his head, warning her to stay quiet. The judge turned his attention back to Ethan. "Ethan, I know this has been a long day for you, but I need to ask a few more questions. Can you handle that?" Ethan nodded, his small face pale but determined. "Good," the judge said gently. "You mentioned earlier that your mother sometimes says things that make you feel scared. Can you tell me more about that? What kind of things does she say?" Ethan hesitated, his eyes darting between his parents. His father gave him a reassuring nod, and Ethan took a shaky breath. "She says that if I don't listen to her, I'll be sorry," he said quietly. "She says nobody will believe me if I tell the truth." The judge's expression remained calm, though his gaze sharpened slightly. "And has anything ever happened when you didn't do what she asked?" Ethan hesitated again, his small hands fidgeting nervously in his lap. "Sometimes she yells a lot," he admitted, "and one time she threw a plate." The courtroom stood at this, and Ethan's mother's face turned bright red. She leaned forward, her voice breaking through the quiet. "I never hurt him," she blurted out, her voice high and defensive. The judge's gavel came down sharply. "Mrs. Carter, this is not your turn to speak. Please refrain from interrupting." Ethan flinched at the outburst, his shoulders hunching even further. His father reached over and gently squeezed his hand, grounding him. The judge turned back to Ethan, his tone softening again. "Ethan, thank you for sharing that. I know it's not easy to talk about. Is there anything else you'd like to tell me? Anything you think I should know about your time with your mom or your dad?" Ethan hesitated, his gaze falling to his lap. For a moment, it seemed like he might not say anything. But then, in a voice so quiet that the room had to strain to hear, he said, "Sometimes I hear Mommy on the phone, talking about Daddy. She says bad things about him. She says she'll do whatever it takes to make sure he never gets to see me again." The words landed like a thunderclap, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable. Ethan's mother's attorney stood abruptly, his expression tight. "Your Honor, we need to request a moment to address these allegations." But the judge cut him off with a raised hand. "You will have your chance, counselor. For now, we'll continue with the testimony." Ethan's mother sat rigid in her chair, her face a mask of fury and desperation. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the edge of the table, her eyes boring into her son as if willing him to stop talking. The judge turned back to Ethan one last time. "Ethan, thank you for being so brave today. I know this hasn't been easy. We'll take everything you've said very seriously as we move forward." Ethan nodded again, his small frame sagging with the weight of the day. His father leaned down and whispered something in his ear, and for the first time in what felt like hours, Ethan allowed a tiny, fleeting smile. But even as the judge called for another recess, the tension in the room refused to dissipate. The air was thick with unspoken questions and unresolved truths, and everyone present knew that this case was far from over. There were still secrets lurking beneath the surface, waiting to be uncovered, and the most shocking revelations were yet to come. As the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere was thick with unease. Everyone seemed to understand that the stakes had risen exponentially. Ethan sat quietly next to his father, his small hands clasped tightly in his lap. His father leaned down, whispering reassurances, but Ethan's eyes kept darting toward his mother, who was now visibly on edge. Her lawyer sat beside her, furiously scribbling notes and glancing around the room as though calculating his next move. The judge took his seat and addressed the room. "We will continue to examine the evidence presented. Both parties will have the opportunity to respond, but I remind everyone that the focus of this proceeding is the well-being of the child. Let's proceed with that in mind." Ethan's father's attorney stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, we would like to submit further evidence that corroborates Ethan's testimony. It includes recorded voicemails and text messages that shed light on the dynamics of the relationship between Mrs. Carter and her son." She gestured to the bailiff, who handed over a stack of papers and a USB drive. Ethan's mother stiffened in her seat, her face turning pale. "What is this?" she hissed, leaning toward her lawyer. He quickly whispered something to her, trying to calm her down, but the tension was palpable. The judge reviewed the documents briefly before nodding. "Proceed." The attorney stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "Your Honor, we have recordings of Mrs. Carter making statements that align with the allegations Ethan has bravely shared today. These include threats directed at Mr. Carter and comments that imply a disregard for Ethan's emotional well-being." She paused, letting her words sink in. "We also have a series of messages that reveal a pattern of manipulation and hostility." The judge nodded, signaling for the first recording to be played. The courtroom fell silent as an audio clip filled the room. Ethan's mother's voice was unmistakable. Her tone was sharp, almost venomous, as she spoke about ensuring Ethan's father would never have a place in his life. The words were cutting, laced with anger and bitterness. Ethan flinched at the sound, and his father placed a protective arm around him. Across the room, Ethan's mother's face twisted in indignation. "This is taken out of context," she exclaimed, rising to her feet. Her lawyer quickly grabbed her arm, pulling her back down. The judge banged his gavel, his voice stern. "Mrs. Carter, you will remain silent unless addressed." The audio continued, each word adding weight to the growing tension in the room. By the time it ended, the courtroom was abuzz with murmurs. The judge leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Do you have anything to say in response, counselor?" he asked, looking at Mrs. Carter's lawyer. Her lawyer stood, clearing his throat. "Your Honor, while these recordings are concerning, I must emphasize that they reflect moments of frustration during a highly contentious custody dispute. They do not necessarily indicate a pattern of behavior that would endanger the child." The judge raised an eyebrow but didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned his attention back to Ethan's father's attorney. "Do you have anything further to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," she said, stepping forward again. We also have testimony from individuals who have witnessed interactions between Mrs. Carter and Ethan. These witnesses include neighbors and teachers who have expressed concerns about Mrs. Carter's behavior. Ethan's mother shot a glare toward the attorney, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but she shook her head, her frustration evident. The first witness was called, a neighbor who had lived next door to the family for several years. She was an older woman, her demeanor calm and composed as she took the stand. "I'd seen Ethan playing outside many times," she began, "and I've heard arguments coming from inside the house. Sometimes they were so loud I could hear every word. Mrs. Carter would yell at Ethan, call him names. It wasn't the kind of thing a child should ever have to hear." Ethan's mother's lawyer immediately rose, his tone sharp. "Objection, Your Honor. This is hearsay." The judge considered for a moment before nodding. "Sustained. Please refrain from making subjective statements about what you overheard. Focus on factual observations." The neighbor nodded. "Of course, I see Ethan come outside crying more than once, and sometimes he'd sit on the porch for hours looking scared. That's what I've observed." The next witness was one of Ethan's teachers. She described a pattern of withdrawn and anxious behavior that had started to emerge over the past year. "Ethan is a bright child," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "But there were days when he seemed distracted, even fearful. When I asked him if everything was okay at home, he would avoid eye contact and say, 'Mommy's mad at me again.'" Ethan's mother shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her face flushed with anger. She whispered furiously to her lawyer, but he shook his head, signaling her to stay quiet. As the testimonies continued, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew heavier. Each new piece of evidence painted a picture that was difficult to ignore. Ethan's father sat silently, his focus entirely on his son, who was now leaning against him, visibly exhausted from the day's events. Finally, the judge called for a short recess, signaling that the final phase of the hearing was approaching. Ethan's mother stormed out of the courtroom, her lawyer trailing behind her, trying to calm her down. Ethan and his father remained seated, the boy resting his head against his father's arm. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Everyone in the room could sense that the case was nearing its peak, but the most critical revelations had yet to be unveiled. As people filed back into the courtroom for the final stretch, an undeniable sense of anticipation filled the room. The truth was on the brink of being fully exposed, and no one could predict what would happen next. As everyone settled back into their seats, the air in the courtroom felt even heavier than before. The judge glanced at the clock, then looked over the room with an expression of measured seriousness. He cleared his throat, signaling the continuation of the proceedings. Ethan sat quietly, his small frame looking even smaller in the oversized chair. His father gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze, but even he couldn't hide the tension in his face. Across the room, Ethan's mother was visibly agitated, her lawyer whispering to her with increasing urgency. The judge turned to Ethan's father's attorney. "Do you have any additional evidence or witnesses to present?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied confidently. "We request to bring forward one final piece of evidence, something that will provide clarity on the events leading up to this custody dispute." The courtroom grew quieter, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone in the room collectively holds their breath. The attorney gestured to the bailiff, who handed a sealed envelope to the judge. As the judge opened it, Ethan's mother shot to her feet, her voice trembling with panic. "What is this? What are you trying to do now?" she exclaimed. The judge raised his gavel, his tone firm but calm. "Mrs. Carter, you will remain seated and silent until it is your turn to speak." She sat back down reluctantly, but her hands gripped the edge of the table tightly, her knuckles turning white. Her lawyer leaned in, trying to placate her, but it was clear her composure was unraveling. The judge examined the contents of the envelope, his expression unreadable. After a moment, he handed it back to the attorney, who addressed the room. "Your Honor, this document is a report from a private investigator hired to assess the conditions of both households. It contains detailed findings regarding the environments in which Ethan has been living." The words hung in the air, and Ethan's mother visibly stiffened. "A private investigator," she muttered under her breath, her voice dripping with disbelief. The attorney continued, "The report includes photographic evidence and testimonies that highlight discrepancies between what has been presented in court and the reality of Ethan's living situation." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The attorney began to read excerpts from the report, detailing instances of neglect and hostile behavior. One particular excerpt described an incident where Ethan was allegedly left alone for hours while his mother attended a social gathering. Photographs were shown. Ethan sitting on a couch in a dimly lit room, looking out a window with a forlorn expression. The images struck a chord with everyone in the room, even the most stoic onlookers. Ethan's mother's lawyer immediately objected, his voice sharp. "Your Honor, this evidence is circumstantial and does not provide the full context of these situations." The judge held up a hand. "Objection noted. However, the court will consider all evidence presented." Just as the attorney prepared to continue, the doors to the courtroom swung open. A man in a neatly pressed suit walked in, carrying a folder. He moved with purpose, his gaze unwavering as he approached Ethan's father's attorney. Whispers rippled through the courtroom as he handed the folder to her and whispered something inaudible. The attorney's eyes widened as she opened the folder and scanned its contents. She looked up at the judge, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "Your Honor, we have just received additional evidence that directly pertains to this case. With the court's permission, I would like to submit it." The judge, clearly intrigued, gestured for her to proceed. "Let's see it." She took a deep breath before addressing the room. "This is a sworn affidavit from a former acquaintance of Mrs. Carter. The individual claims to have witnessed behavior that calls into question her fitness as a parent." Her voice grew heavier as she continued. "The affidavit includes specific details about actions that, if verified, would suggest a deliberate attempt to alienate Ethan from his father." Ethan's mother's face turned ashen. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, standing up again. "This is nothing but lies. Who is this person?" The judge banged his gavel. "Mrs. Carter, I will not tolerate further outbursts. You will remain silent." The attorney hesitated for a moment, then continued. "The affidavit also references financial records and conversations that indicate a possible motive for Mrs. Carter's actions, a motive that extends beyond the well-being of their son." The room was stunned into silence. Even Ethan's father, who had remained composed throughout the trial, looked taken aback. Ethan glanced up at him, his young face full of confusion and unease. The judge leaned forward, his expression serious. "Does the affidavit provide specifics regarding these allegations?" "Yes, Your Honor," the attorney replied. "It details conversations where Mrs. Carter allegedly expressed concerns about losing access to certain financial benefits if custody were awarded to Mr. Carter. It also mentions transactions that suggest misuse of funds intended for Ethan's care." The tension in the room reached a breaking point. Ethan's mother looked like she might explode, her face red with anger and embarrassment. Her lawyer stood, his voice firm but controlled. "Your Honor, these allegations are baseless and amount to character assassination. We request time to review this new evidence and prepare a response." The judge nodded. "The court will allow time for review. However, given the gravity of these allegations, we will reconvene tomorrow to address them in full." As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the day's proceedings, the courtroom erupted into murmurs. Ethan's mother stormed out, her lawyer trailing behind her, while Ethan and his father remained seated, surrounded by reporters and curious onlookers. Ethan looked up at his father, his voice barely above a whisper. "What's going to happen now?" His father knelt down, placing his hands gently on Ethan's shoulders. "We're going to keep telling the truth, buddy. That's all we can do." But even as he spoke, there was an unspoken question in his eyes, a question everyone in the courtroom was asking themselves. What would happen when the truth was fully revealed? And who, in the end, would bear the consequences? The uncertainty hung over them like a storm cloud, the tension building with every passing second.